Welcome to Metacomp. This will be part one in the arc, in the Great Being War arc. A being's calling Dividing the Left. You know how they say, we need to unite the left? Beings deciding it needs to be shotgunned into oblivion before it can come back stronger than ever. Our first target in our quick scope 360 Call of Duty is Anark. And of course, as always, nobody else would be here. Nobody else but Piper would be here because Piper is the strongest soldier in being Stoning Army. So before we start reacting to this Stoicism video, would you like to give a preamble?
Anark made a video a while ago trying to argue for like a marriage between anarchism and stoicism. Stoicism is an ancient philosophical tradition. Now, not only do I not think it's compatible with anarchism, but also I'm not sure why people constantly do this thing where they have to pair anarchist political philosophy with all kinds of other stuff that has nothing to do with it. Like, it's just sort of weird that anarchist political philosophy isn't enough because anarchism does come along with a philosophy, right? And so, I think it would be much more productive for anarchists to explore that than to try to marry it with all this other random crap. But yeah, so we're gonna see what goes wrong when you try to marry anarchism with an ancient, rather apolitical form of philosophy. So
Right. You would think, anarchism, it's a part of socialism. Socialism's a full-blown cosmological system. It's a political ideology. You'd think that'd be enough for people, but apparently it isn't. And so we're gonna, I guess, see if we can pair anarchism, it's like a nice course fine dining with stoicism, a random turd we found outside across the street. Let's see how we do this. The great Anarch's gonna tell us.
Hey everyone, Anark here, and today we're going to talk about the philosophy of Stoicism, mostly from a left perspective. However, I imagine whether you're left or right, you already have some preconceptions about
all right, pause
Stoicism.
it. Pause
Stoic
it. There's already a problem. Okay, why are you doing this from a left perspective? Why not from an anarchist perspective in particular? Like that's a thing that I think anarchists should just stop doing. This like, oh, we need to speak for the left. Like, no, you don't, right? You speak for anarchism. Anarchism is a leftist political ideology, right? But it's a specific leftist political ideology, right? And we don't care about the other ones, right? We're not adhere, we aren't trying to, achieve success for Marxism, Leninism, or Trotskyism, or Bordegism, or anything else, right? We want success for anarchism, right? So why are we doing this from a leftist perspective, quote unquote?
You're not trying to hang out with the Jacobins behind the bleachers or try to like join the populist club?
No, yeah, I don't think there should be left unity between like whatever's left of Arab socialism and fucking anarchism. Or more, I mean usually what left unity means in left-wing circles today is letting Marxist Leninists or Trotskyists try to like lead struggles, right? And it's like, so that's, unless you think that's a good idea, I don't know why we're talking about this from the perspective of the left.
Stoicism is often viewed as being very conservative, promoting rugged individualist values. In a broad cultural sense, Stoicism is viewed as being about suppressing one's emotions, about being numb. Leftists often see it as a philosophy which promotes drawing inwards and not concerning oneself with political causes. For that reason, marble statue avatars and right wing influencers are much more likely to come to mind when Stoicism is mentioned than anarchism. But the foundations of Stoicism might surprise you. And when we understand Stoicism as a philosophy better, we discover something that's much more subtle and universal than many right wing adherents would propose. Indeed, even if you don't want to become a Stoic by the end of this video, I think it will give you some food for thought on how to live a better life. So stick around if that sounds interesting, because that's going to be the topic of our video today.
Okay, so one more thing here before we get into the video proper is that when you have these moral codes, right, that are separate from politics, right? This is actually something that's problematic from the anarchist or socialist perspective, right? Because remember, I mean, Anark, I don't think, Anark's even going to try to argue that the Stoics, that Stoicism entails an anarchist political philosophy, right? So Stoicism here is going to be a particular approach to how to live life, right? Like what the good life is, right? But these approaches to what the good life is that are sort of, part of ancient philosophy and are sort of separated out from politics and political ideology, mostly because political ideology didn't exist in ancient times and politics was viewed as another sphere of ethics, right? These strictly ethical approaches to the good life, right? In the sense that, okay, politics, that's over here, ethics is over here, and if anything, politics is just an outgrowth of ethics, right? That creates a kind of contemplative, speculative, sort of armchair relationship to philosophy that's detached from actually changing the world, right? And so, the focus becomes on transforming yourself as an individual, living a certain way as an individual, aligning yourself with certain obligations as an individual, rather than transforming the society you live in, which is the goal of anarchism or socialism, right? And so this is why Karl Marx, in his famous thesis on, or theses on Feuerbach, says that the philosophers have, interpreted the world enough, right? The point is to change it. That's not him saying that we shouldn't do philosophy, but it's him saying that philosophy now needs to be joined up with the communist or socialist political program, right? And so anarchists are also going to sign up to that basic point of view, right? So, the fact that we're already looking at this as like, this is, this sort of apolitical ethic, right? I mean, that's already a problem.
So, what is Stoicism? Stoicism is a school of Greek and later Roman philosophy, which is focused on how to live a good life. And that wasn't unique among the Greeks. In fact, Greek philosophy was primarily concerned with how to live a good life. But what characterizes Stoicism is its emphasis on how to deal with the difficulties in life. And that makes sense when you consider the founder of Stoicism, the Greek philosopher Zeno of Citium. But Zeno was not always a philosopher. Earlier in his life, he was actually a merchant. In his early 20s, he was making his way back home with a shipment when a storm shipwrecked his boat, and that destroyed his entire livelihood. It plunged him into poverty, but he began his journey into philosophy. He later said, "I made a prosperous voyage when I suffered shipwreck." This is because after the shipwreck, he didn't try to return to the life of a merchant. Zeno went and learned about every school of philosophy at the time, even studying under the Cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes. In fact, Stoicism is probably most influenced by Cynicism. However, he found that Cynicism still didn't quite get it right. Whereas Cynicism told people to remove themselves from political life, he believed in the concept of a civic duty. And like a lot of other Greek philosophers, he believed in a virtue ethics, but he just thought that they had way too many virtues to keep track of. He thought that they needed to simplify the number of virtues. So Stoicism is a philosophy based around the cult.
All right. So that's something that we should flag immediately, which is that, yes, it's not surprising that Stoicism would have to do with civic virtue, right? Because, philosophy, ancient philosophy, was dominated by this idea of, being an ethical social animal within a polis, right? Like, basically, it's the ancient world, right? People's political agency isn't separated from spiritual forces or the supernatural. There's not a conception of time moving forward in terms of linear progress. It's, more the cycles of nature, right? And so politics, it's not about like using human agency to transform the world, right? Like it is in the modern world. It's about the proper management of society's affairs, right? According to what the gods want or what virtue demands, or both. Usually with, both. And so because of that, when Anark says this is, this is connected to civic virtue, that's what that refers to, right? This pre-modern social structure in which, again, the only political thought that's taking place is political thought about managing the cyclical organization of society's affairs, right? It's not about, in fact, achieving social progress through the exercise of human agency and political subjectivity, right? Which is what anarchism is about, because anarchism is a political ideology. It's a modern social movement of the oppressed masses to boot, which, back in these times, the oppressed masses are engaging in, social theory and ideological, well, they're not engaging, obviously they're not engaging in ideological mobilization, because that only comes around with modernity. But because of that, they're also pretty much not at all engaging in intellectual life. Like, the Greek philosopher is somebody who has like a slave, who serves them so that the Greek philosopher can, reflect on life. Right. And this is not me saying there's nothing of value in ancient or Greek philosophy, but it is me saying that this civic virtue bit exemplifies just how incompatible Stoicism is as a system with anarchism.
I have nothing to add other than I didn't meet many Greek philosophers because I kept getting lost in the Mediterranean Sea.
Cultivation of 4 key virtues. And those key virtues are wisdom, self-discipline, often called temperance, justice, and courage. So the first one on the list, wisdom, isn't only knowledge, which people absolutely should cultivate, but it's also good reasoning. It's caring about the truth and logic, but also absorbing deeper lessons about life. Self-discipline, or temperance, isn't about receiving external discipline, but instead about the cultivation of self-control over one's actions and consistency in one's behavior. It's also about good judgment, not falling victim to stereotype or knee-jerk, but understanding situations within their context. The third one, justice, isn't associated with the legal concept of justice. It's instead about treating others fairly and honestly, about fulfilling one's duties to others, and in recognizing the common humanity of all other people. And the last one on the list, courage.
Notice that idea of justice, right? It has to do with fulfilling certain obligations, right, within the social sphere. It does not have to do with the transformation of society with the use of political agency, right? So that's sort of highlighting my point here, that this sort of pre-modern philosophy stuff is pre-political ideology, and thus represents, like, if you're focusing on that rather than, the philosophical thieves within anarchism, you're sort of taking a step backward now.
Yeah, it's an odd, like, oh, right-wingers will identify with Stoicism and they'll have the marble statues, so I guess the plan here is to, like, politicize Stoicism for anarchism, but I wouldn't know the point of that, honestly, when anarchism already comes with an idea of what courage is, what justice is, what wisdom is.
Right.
These are already in the political philosophy of anarchism, right? Your ethical, your sense of justice, it's going to be, fighting against the oppression of governance and sovereignty, and affirming, the rules of free association, and demanding everybody, live in voluntary, I guess the way I'm saying it's like, I order you to be in free association.
Well, it is a demand, right? It's a demand against the existing social order,
right? Right. Yeah. I demand you be free. I demand you not be alienated.
Exactly.
But that is, why, instead of this video, why don't you make the video where it's like, yeah, you could look at Stoicism, but anarchism has these political thinkers and they provide a better moral framework that's applicable to a modern world. Instead of getting your ethics, your political ethics, modern political ethics from Stoics, why don't you read some Rodolph Rocker or Malatesta or a number of other anarchists? Maybe bring up their arguments on justice and courage and wisdom.
Right, exactly, yeah. I mean, especially since, like, Kropotkin actually wrote, this is, like, little known, Kropotkin, who's, like, one of the most famous anarchist thinkers ever, right? He actually wrote a book on ethics, right? And so, maybe you would want to consult that, instead of, like, going back to ancient Greece. Like, look, I take a very Hegelian approach to all of this, so I think the history of thought is important. I think you need to, there's enough of value in ancient philosophy to, make it, prudent to understand the canons of ancient philosophy when you're trying to understand the history of human thought, right? And I think understanding the history of human thought is important, but that doesn't mean you should be getting your ethics from Stoicism to then supplement anarchism, which doesn't need supplementing.
Yeah, this is such a weird, like, attempt to, like, I'm going to take something that's identified with the right wing on the internet and try to co-opt it for anarchism. It's such an odd project to do, but okay.
Is the facing of fear and hardship and overcoming them. Courage is also at the root of perseverance. It's the willingness to endure difficulties and to speak truth to power. In the view of the Stoics, these 4 virtues are what it means to live a good life. Not health or wealth or community or any other worldly factor. This isn't to say that those aren't desirable. It's instead to say that if one doesn't cultivate the virtues, all those other good things still won't lead to a good life. These virtues also can't be cultivated alone. To be wise is also to be just, because wisdom cultivates one's discernment between good and bad. It takes courage to carry out what one knows to be just, and it takes self-discipline to abide by your principles. To be unjust is therefore to be unwise, cowardly, and lacking self-discipline. To be courageous, one must also be self-disciplined, because self-discipline is what allows one to practice courage in the face of terrible obstacles. One must also be wise in order to know what values to discipline oneself toward, and just in the adherence to our principles. There are all kinds of examples given in the literature, but for now I want to move on to another one of the key principles of Stoicism that I think is very valuable, and that is the separating of what one can control from what one cannot control.
Okay, this latter part's pretty important here, but I just want to, like, talk about for a minute this, like, easy quotes, flowery kind of, like, stuff going on with Anark where he's like, wisdom to be wise and courageous against the bad. It's to be good. It's just like, it's like, why not, you use the opportunity to, like, quote anarchists about courage and also, like, courage and wisdom and justice are not, like, unique to Stoicism, like, at all.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Like, because, and that's actually good that you point that out, because he's not actually explaining what Stoicism is. He's explaining, like, maybe, like, the top brainy quotes that you would find for Stoic philosophers or whatever, but he's not told us anything about what Stoicism actually is, right? Just in case he never gets to it, right? Stoicism is an ancient tradition in ancient philosophy which emphasizes sort of retracting from worldly connections and cultivating your own character so as not to be polluted by those worldly connections, right? So, there are similar ideas in, for instance, Eastern philosophy or Eastern religion, where the idea is, you have to disconnect yourself from all these things that you're involved in the world and, sort of mold your own character separate from it in order to be sort of purified as an individual. So, that's what Stoicism is. He hasn't really told us anything about that. He's just kind of he's basically just told us about virtue ethics and told us about a Stoic philosopher who, got into Stoicism after experiencing a shipwreck. So he hasn't really told us what it is.
Well, we're about to get there. He's about to do a deep dive as to what even it is. So let's do it.
All right.
And the Stoics always try to remind us to focus our minds on that which we can control. When we focus ourselves on what we can't control, we're always made miserable because we're vesting our emotional well-being in the outcome of a thing which moves with or without our approval, a thing that we can't even stop at our own will. In fact, the Enchiridion, which is a book, which is a sort of like summary of the thoughts of Epictetus, who is a Stoic philosopher, opens with the line, "Some things are in our control and others are not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, property, reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever are not our own actions." And this principle, to be fair, I think this is where the misconception that Stoicism is like apolitical or only focused on the individual comes from. I think a lot of people hear that and they assume that that means that you don't control any of the world around you, therefore you shouldn't worry yourself with politics or social structures or injustice. However, in practice, the Stoics have never been the sorts to shrink from political engagement. People who have been rich and poor, people who've been powerful and marginal, have all found lessons in Stoicism. In fact, it's named
Yeah,
as
but
it is because
that's the thing which sort of indicates that it's at least not political in the way that anarchism is political, right? In other words, this is an ethic that anybody from any station of life, at least in principle, right, provided they're not a slave, right, which a lot of people were at this time, can, and with any sort of interest in politics. And again, this is before there was an idea of like, the use of political agency to change society into a more ideal state, right? That's a modern thing, right? But, anybody from any station in life, right, with any form of engagement in politics can apply Stoicism because it's just a personal ethic, right? Whereas anarchism is a political ideology, right, which lends itself to being practiced best by the masses in struggles for their freedom and struggles for the reshaping of society along the lines of free association. And so anarchism as a political ideology directs its ethical conclusions toward a particular political end, whereas Stoicism does not. So, you're not actually like sort of defeating the argument that this is, at least from, if you're comparing it to anarchism, it is apolitical in the sense that it doesn't have the kinds of substantive political ties that anarchism has.
I wanna interrogate actually, hold on. I wanna interrogate this quote that was brought up. Yeah, so this quote's kind of egregious if you're an anarchist.
Yes, it is.
I don't know why you'd let this slide. I don't know why you would even try to even defend this quote. For one thing, anarchism is agentic. Actually, all the political ideologies are agentic. Now, some of the political ideologies are more willing to accept that things are not in your control more than others. Conservatism is probably the most famous example of this with the Burkean stuff about the sublime and all those things. However, even in conservatism, there's a lot that it demands you are in control of or part of preserving, right? Demands a lot of human agency to defend property and body. And so even in that case, even in the conservatism case, yeah, you're preserving them, but you still have to be involved in them. This quote is saying you should just sort of, they're not in your control. You should just focus on other things. So it's kind of funny that like Stoicism is sort of not only antagonistic to anarchism, it's arguably antagonistic to like conservatism, fascism, and all the other ideologies as well. Like it just seems like the reason right wingers like it is because it's like associated with the old Chad face meme and it sounds cool rather than something that you could really principally adhere to while also engaging in ideology. You
Well,
know?
yeah, I mean, this is why Hegel, as a modern philosopher and as a centrist liberal, essentially, right, actually offers a critique of Stoicism, right? Because what Hegel says is that Stoicism represents what he calls the unhappy consciousness, and the unhappy consciousness is the state of mind that people are in when they view the world as polluting them. They view the world as something they can't control, and so they sort of move into themselves and away from the world, right? in an effort to purify themselves of all these worldly things which are contrary to their character and outside of their control, at least in their, at least from their point of view. And Hegel's point there, as a modern philosopher who's doing modern political philosophy, is, well, this is unhelpful or unhealthy in the sense that now you're basically just, first of all, you can't escape from being part of the world. So there's no like purifying yourself in that sense. But then also, that's basically just like ignoring your capacity as a human being for transforming the world to make it better, right? And so, like, ultimately, it's a sort of misguided acceptance of the status quo, which is, I guess, something that Anark was trying to debunk about Stoicism. He was trying to say that's not what this is, but I don't really see that he said anything to rebut Hegel's critique.
Yeah, it's kind of obvious that Stoics would be rich or they'd find themselves in the world, right? The philosophy is saying, yeah, you find yourself in the world. And so, in order to purify yourself, you need to remove yourself from the world. So, yeah, Stoics are going to be part of the world.
Right.
I don't know. That's not a contradiction of Stoicism. Yeah. So, like, that's part of the decadence you need to remove yourself from. So, like, yeah. Oh, there's Stoics who are rich people. Okay. That doesn't say anything. It's like when people do this thing of like, oh, you say you're Christian, but you engage in all of this sin. Like, yeah, that's the thing you're trying to avert. That's not a hypocrisy. That's just part of the whole kit and caboodle, right? Like, but I really want to interrogate this quote because it's so like, first off, when it comes to anarchism, political ideology is obsessed more generally with the human condition. In fact, the human condition was argued to preserve and also to remove slavery. It's just like one example of a billion. And anarchists should be, I would hope, would be for people having control over the human condition, their bodies. Abortion, for example, that's a whole debate about the body, and morphological freedom, right? That's part of anarcho-transhumanism. So I being cannot just simply be like, well, the body's not. I'd have to like hang up the whole channel. Property. Property. If you're a communist,
Look, if you're like, what is like the foundational anarchist text? Okay, well, at least one of them. What is property by Proudhon? What does Proudhon say in that text? Essentially, that property is illegitimate. We should get rid of it. Right? What is this quote saying about property? Let's compare the two.
Yeah. Well, and Proudhon, like, it's funny because that's mutualism, and even even mutualism is saying, so like it's just egregious. It's just for like a socialist or anarchist to be like, oh well, property is whatever, just leave it alone. It's like that's like what? Um, Reputation, that's going to be concerning like social status, and that's often very oppressive, and that needs to be
Yeah.
reconfigured. Command, I don't even think I need to say why anarchism would be very concerned with. I don't even think I have to say why anarchism would be very concerned with command. The etymology of anarchism. Not that I would define it that way, but like, don't need to say this, but anarchists are against commanders. And of course, in one word, whatever are not our own actions. Yeah, again, political ideologies are very agentic. They're earthly. They're concerned earthly forces, humans. I don't know how. This is funny because this is like a very pre-modern philosophy, like very profoundly pre-modern. A lot of what it's saying, so it makes sense for where it developed out of. Not to say that all pre-modern philosophies didn't involve human agencies. They did. Religions do involve that, but although the way religions are imagined and consciously conceived is the idea that those extra agentic non-earthly forces are moving through you and you're serving them and things like that.
Well, in particular, it's politics is not something that can be transformed by human agency. Like maybe you can, maybe politics is like seen as something that rests on human agency, but it's also something that, is seen to rest on, in the ancient world, the cycles of nature or the will of the gods, right? It's not, this purely human institutional construction that it is in modernity, right? Even for religious people, right? So, it's particularly political agency is very compromised in the thought of the ancient world. And the point that you said about, well, this is, this sort of makes sense for its time. This is the sort of Hegelian or sort of Marxian point, which is that, you have to understand the history of thought in terms of not only the historical development of human thought, but also the social relations that human thought is enmeshed in their historical development, right? And so, this is a point that we've been making about this is a philosophy that's attuned to the ancient world, right? It's not something that you're going to fruitfully mix with a modern political ideology like anarchism.
Yeah, I don't know how. I mean, you could do this in cyclical time pretty easily. I don't even, I mean, well, maybe not easily, but it'd be a lot easier than in modernity where time is in flux and, identity is not just given, it's a task that you have to constantly like work on. So I don't even know how you'd even be a stoic. I mean, people say they are. I mean, that's the thing about modernity, right? People go find these old things and they reinvent them and then they, as they do with everything. So, but yeah.
As it is, because the Stoa, which were the porches, were these public areas where they could preach to people. I mean, think about the fact that Marcus Aurelius, who was the emperor of Rome, was a Stoic. Think about the fact that Seneca, an advisor to Nero, was a Stoic. There are fair criticisms to be had of
what makes Stoicism very compatible with anarchism? The fact that emperors liked it.
Oh yeah, as we all know, we anarchists need to be in that emperor grind set. Yeah, okay. Not interested. No, thank you.
Last two figures there, especially, but it's hard to square that observation with the idea that the Stoics are all about political disengagement. So with that in mind, how do we square this all together? How does it make sense that we have to have that separation, and yet the Stoics do not advocate us removing ourselves from broader social problems? Well, I think the important thing to understand here is that this is not a denial that we have an ability to interact with the world. It's simply re-emphasizing that interaction always takes place through our bodily capacities. So like, for example, you might say that you have control over your lamp, but the only way that you exert control over the lamp is by using your body. You reach your hand out and you click the switch and the lamp turns on. Or you might say that you have like control over other people's perceptions of you. But in reality, all you really have control over is how you present yourself and how you speak to others. You have control over your own actions. You have control over the way you dress or the things you say.
Very anarchist, like ritzy, fucking bougie looking people at a fucking nightclub, or in like it actually looks like a gentleman's club. It's a very anarchist aesthetic right there.
I don't know too much about Epic, the whatever guy, but I feel like when he said, things that concern your body, you shouldn't concern. I think that means like anatomic, like physiological, like, you lose an arm, you've lost it. I don't think it meant like you literally can't like blow out the candles on your birthday cake. Like, I don't think that was really what was like. I thought I would assume it's like, biology, right? Like how you're born. I mean, they're not gonna say biology the same way, but presumably it's like, look, I was born with an extra foot. Oh well, it's not that it's something I can do. I can't do. I mean, especially in the ancient world, there's not really much you can do about genetics,
Right,
so I feel like that's what it's, I feel like that's obviously what it's referring to, like the bodily state you're in, like you can't really do much about it.
But you don't actually have control over how they ultimately do perceive you. And I think that this is a really important thing to understand. It's sort of at the center of the Stoic philosophy. When we confuse our own scope of control, we are almost always going to be frustrated by the lack of control of those external things. And if not frustrated, we're going to be confused or depressed or whatever it is. So, for example, if you think you actually have control over the lamp, then you're probably going to be frustrated when you reach out to turn it on and the bulb doesn't work or the wiring has gone bad or something. And likewise, if you think you have control over the perceptions of others, you're going to be really frustrated when you find that people are spreading rumors about you or telling lies about you.
That's interesting. You say that. Curricular. Just so everybody knows, there's some beef hanging in the air here. You see, Anark fast-jacketed beings being dared to not use spaghetti list and actually applied, the academic consensus of the generic type of fascism. And because being dared be a Griffinite, Anark said, "You're dividing the left and you're a fascist." Or, well, he didn't. It wasn't so much you're a fascist, but you're enabling fascists, right? So, fast jacketing. So yeah, maybe you know what? You're right. I can't do anything about people spreading rumors about being, But what being could do is make this video. That's something that is within being's control. So
Yeah.
Something that you don't have control over. All you have control over is your own actions. You don't have control over how they ultimately then act after those actions. To prevent that frustration, to prevent that hopelessness, that despair, the Stoics are trying to remind us to always return our minds to that which we do control, and not those things outside of ourselves that we do not control. The Stoics are trying to get us to internalize what psychologists call an internal locus of control, which is something that I actually brought up in the healthy masculinity video, if people might recall. This isn't a denial that outside forces affect us. It's a reminder that those outside forces can only be changed by our conscious and deliberate actions, and by us taking responsibility for what our actions affect. This, when combined then with the Stoic virtue of justice, that creates a politically active orientation.
no, I feel like this is just word games where we're manipulating. We say broad thing, we manipulate it, and we try to forcibly apply it to other things. No, I feel like you're just playing word games here. It's pretty obvious what the Stoics meant, what they were trying to do, and we're just Oh, they said justice and courage, and they said what you can and can't control. But if we think about it, in order to control things, you have to control yourself. So really, Stoicism can be anarchist if we interpret this thing as that thing. It's like I feel like you're just abusing words. No, I think it's kind of obvious, even from that little quote, that also that makes sense, right? Like you shouldn't question your station in life in that ancient, like that's expected of you in the ancient world, right? Don't
Yeah.
question your status. Do what just worry about where you find yourself, and then remove yourself to purify yourself.
Right.
I don't think any of the stuff. I also wouldn't even know what they would do with you. They'd probably try and kill you because you're an anarchist. Well, that's questionable, but we won't give that too much now, will we?
I mean that they had no concept of anarchism or anything like that. Like that wasn't a thing.
That's true. They'd be like, "What is that?" And then he'd try to explain poorly, and then they'd kill him anyways because whatever.
You are a threat to the Athenian polis.
Yeah, but he's like, "No, wait. I actually am for citizenship. I'm for civic duty. No."
Remember that you can't live a good life with just 3 of the 4 virtues. Someone cannot be properly self-disciplined, wise, and courageous who ignores justice. So, with that in mind, let's return to what the Stoic conception of justice is. And the first thing I want to say is that this is not just a personal conception of justice, and it is not a legal conception of justice. That is to say, justice is not just what is law. Justice is actually a social phenomena in Stoicism. It's related to this word oikeiosis. And oikeiosis actually shares etymological roots with words such as economy, ecology, and household. It's basically a philosophy of affinity based on closeness. There was a Stoic philosopher.
Yeah, so, okay, if I remember correctly, it's the domestic, the neighbor, familiarization, epic. Okay. Well, I don't know what this has to do with anarchism, but all right.
Philosopher named Hierocles, which actually expanded on this concept of oikeiosis, and he did so by creating what he calls circles of concern. And these circles are the self, the family, fellow citizens, countrymen, and then humanity as a whole. So you can see here the diagram on
Humanity as a
screen.
whole is like a fucking. That's really not the priority. Humanity as a whole. Yeah. All right. So we're gonna oppose xenophobia, right, as anarchists, and then we're gonna agree with this.
Yeah, let's adopt this xenophobic consequently in today's world, nativistic mentality about where our priorities should be.
Yeah, yeah. Like this is basically what Ben Shapiro thinks like the fucking map of concern should be for the modern person.
I think conservatives have literally brought this up of like circles thing.
Yes, they do it all the time.
I don't. What is this about? Like this obsession with like, oh, the neighbor, not the stranger, the outsider. You shouldn't care about the outside.
I mean, I don't know.
Foreigner.
I think it's just more book shit and its consequences where fucking like leftoids like have confused like face-to-face democracy with like being against exploitation. It's like really dumb.
When you're face to face with the cop, it's better than when you're not face to face with the cop. You got to be face to face with the guy beating your face in.
And might I add, it probably looks familiar because it is very similar to the circles of social consideration heat map meme that keeps getting passed around on the internet. So I guess you might say that Hierocles has a take on that circles meme that keeps going around. And that is that, yes, the first thing a human develops is their own sense of self, and therefore a sense of self-preservation. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, the consideration of the self and the needs of the self are an integral part of survival. In fact, they're a really important part of Stoicism. However, the belief of the Stoics is that what makes one wise is the expansion of those circles of concern. And as he said, dragging the outward circles inwards. That is to say, treating the people at the most outward circles as just the same as the self or as one's family. This is what wisdom and reason might suggest. In fact, Stoicism has been described as valuing cosmopolitanism as its principle of justice. And you can find conservatives and fascists throughout history talking about how much they despise cosmopolitanism. So this really undercuts the right-wing claim that Stoicism is a fundamentally conservative philosophy.
Okay, this really needs to be emphasized, I think. So I think anarchism, is by definition cosmopolitan and multicultural, right? But you have to be careful because it's not just any form of cosmopolitanism or multiculturalism, right? Because if you'll notice, the dominant form of cosmopolitanism or multiculturalism is a kind of centrist, technocratic, moderate version of those things, right? Where it's like, okay, all the different cultures come together to be integrated within, the hierarchies of the state, the hierarchies of the corporate world, the hierarchies of citizenship and nationhood, the hierarchies of the family, even the hierarchies of race, right, and the hierarchies of gender, and so on and so forth, right, in order to achieve a consensus that works for everybody and is mediated by expertise, right? Like that's the dominant form of multiculturalism or cosmopolitanism in our world, and has been for hundreds of years, at least 200 years, right? And so that form of cosmopolitanism is not the form of cosmopolitanism or multiculturalism that anarchists want. Anarchists want a cosmopolitanism or multiculturalism based on non-hierarchical free association, right? So you have to be careful with this just equating cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism with not right wing so good.
Yeah, I don't know too much. I haven't done too much research into like cosmopolitanism. It's usually the way that it's conceived of as either cosmopolity, so like the international community, commercialism, things like that, or it's just I value the whole of the human community. So
Right.
in terms of if it's valuing the whole of the human community, that's obviously applicable to anarchism. If it's commercialism or international states coming together, like cosmopolity, like literally world polity, then no, obviously not.
Yeah.
I think this is an odd. I don't know. This is also desperate because I think it just okay. Like, yeah, if you're gonna resign yourself from the world, it probably makes sense that you don't make much of a distinction about the world in terms of the regions and everything. So I don't know if like it makes okay. So like I'm cosmopolitan in that it's okay. It's like saying the bumper sticker about the meteor. I vote for the meteor to kill everybody section. You could say that bumper sticker is cosmopolitan because it makes no differences to any nations.
Right, yeah.
But
I'm not racist. I hate everybody equally.
right. And it sort of seems like the Stoic cosmopolitanism is one of like political blindness if we apply it to the modern world. In fact, arguably, you could say it's racial blindness, gender blindness. We're sort of just saying, well, everyone's part of it's all the same to me because it's all equally something I shouldn't be concerned with.
Right.
And it's all something I have to resign myself from. So it makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. If you look at the world as something you shouldn't involve yourself in, it makes sense that you're going to see it as a whole, as a complete thing. And it makes sense you're not going to be concerned about the particulars, especially when you're trying to get away from it.
Right.
So again, I don't know if we should be adopting the whole "I voted for the meteor to blow up the planet." I think anarchism should be both about universal conscious community, not even just humans, as well as it's important to think about the particulars. It's important to address the fact that the way people are socialized, it is through racism, sexism, and it's important to talk about these things and address these things head on. You should be both cosmopolitan and concerned. Cosmopolitan, again, in the very loosey-goosey way of, whole human community. You should be concerned with the whole of humanity, and you should be concerned with how that humanity is divided by power. And you should seek to emancipate people by addressing those. And that's kind of the point of intersectionality.
Yes.
So, an intersectionality can be, I guess, since we're using this term, cosmopolitan, but racial blindness can also be cosmopolitan too.
Correct.
So I think it's not. I think it's about the quality here, not just if we meet a very vague notion of the word.
Exactly.
Conservative ideology, which views the individual and the family as the most important circles, is fundamentally at odds with the Stoic virtue of justice.
Wait, but in your stupid little graph, those are in the immediate area of concern. So those are viewed as most important in the stupid graph. What? Did you not look at the graph? What?
I don't know. Also, this idea that conservatives are concerned with the individual is a very pop conservative disease.
Yeah,
but whatever. I mean, I don't want to get
particularly it's funny because conservatism in the United States and Britain, because of Reagan and Thatcher, pretty much has this aura of individualism around it, which is and so now people just in both those countries, people just conflate conservatism with individualism and see it basically as indistinguishable from libertarianism. And it's but most forms of conservatism actually are not compatible with this individualism, right? It's not, it's not most forms of conservatism put a premium on the community and obligation to the community over personal self-determination. So it's very, it's a very weird effect of the height of the neoliberal era that people started associating with conservatism and individualism with each other.
Also, there's a video he did. He was like, "This is my letter to conservatives." So maybe we'll
terrible. It was literally it should have been my liberal. I mean, it wasn't even useful for a letter to libertarians. God, it was basically define conservatism as when you don't understand that humans are social animals and have communities, right? And so then just be well, conservatism is false because humans are social animals and have communities. It's okay, yes, yeah. Why do you think conservatives hate LGBT people? Is it because they don't think there are communities?
the ignorance about, it used to be, the ignorance about fascism, it's so frustrating, but it's just an ignorance of politics, really. It's not even it's just not knowing what conservatives believe. It's not knowing what liberals believe.
Trash can of ideology.
It's not even knowing what depoliticism is, not knowing what we do this thing where everything is political, which is, there's a truth in that, but there's also parts of the political that provide spaces for the depolitical, and there's also populations who are made non-political by the fact that either they're marginalized from the processes or they resign themselves to not be involved. But these are
Right.
broader. These are other topics. So
Stoics aren't telling us to flee from the political world, and they're not denying that outside forces affect us. They're telling us that if we want to change the world, we have to make ourselves capable of it, while at the same time doing our best to expand our circle of affinity and kinship to all other human beings. So, next, let's address another claim that people usually have about Stoicism, and that is that it wants us to suppress our emotions. However, the Stoics don't advocate the suppression of emotion. What they advocate is emotional control. Stoics view emotions as signals which carry information about the world, and they implore us not to let those emotions take control of our actions. And this is a really important distinction. There's a difference between feeling an emotion and acting on it. So, take anger, for example. Anger is conveying important information to us. Anger is an emotion that we feel when we have some sense that there.
I love the industrial stock footage we're just using for all this.
Well, it's funny because every once in a while you get people looking like they're like looking bougie as like hell, like in that like fucking bar scene or this like office scene where it just like looks really bougie, and it's like this goes along well with anarchism.
I want to be like a stock footage director where it's like you get a random guy, and you're like, okay, and I just scream or mime scream because they're probably not actually screaming, it's probably like miming stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, the whole emotions thing, I'm gonna take a shot in the dark and say Stoics are saying is that you shouldn't waste energy on things you're supposed to be resigning yourself
Yes.
from.
Yeah.
So, if anything, I feel like consequently, Stoicism has like an apathy problem
Yeah.
where we're saying we shouldn't be emotionally invested in what the government is doing or what like racists are doing because it's outside. We shouldn't care about that because to care about that is to expand energy on something we're supposed to be averting.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, that's essentially Hegel's critique of Stoicism.
This is be one of like the worst philosophies to try to politicize because this is just like I think I said this before. This is toxic to every ideology. No ideology should try to claim this.
There is an injustice. However, it's important that we control our actions when we feel anger. When there is injustice, we should ask how we can correct that injustice. However, when we let anger drive our actions, we're prone to destroying things without careful consideration of the outcomes. What if we perceive something wrong? What if our anger drives us to harm innocent people? These are things that happen when we let anger take the steering wheel in our minds.
That's an interesting point. We shouldn't also let ignorance, particularly ignorance about mental disabilities, drive our actions. Drive our actions to tweet about how people with BPD should probably be exiled from free association. That's probably something we shouldn't also do, but we shouldn't also tweet that if you get killed by a fascist, you should feel shame. As if, just wild example, all the pregnant women who were brutally murdered by the Nazis, somehow they should be feeling shame for not.
Look, okay,
Yeah.
the 6 million Jews didn't lift, bro. So like it sucks to suck.
Yeah, why? So I'm sorry Anne Frank couldn't go to a fucking gym. She was kind of busy, hiding. But okay,
And
dude.
being 14.
Yeah, that's kind of a big factor.
Rather than simply letting it inform our actions. Sadness is another good example. Sadness is an indication that something is wrong in our lives. It's an indication that we are not having some kind of need fulfilled. However, when we let sadness drive our actions, we often do things which exacerbate all of the problems in our lives. What good does spiraling for days and days or weeks really do us? What if our sadness drives us to selfishness or disregard for our own health? This is what the Stoics mean when they say that our emotions should be felt and processed, but that they shouldn't direct our actions. Our rationality, informed by our emotions, should direct our actions. So now I'd like to return to Zeno of Citium. A lot of Zeno's works have actually been lost to history. All we have left of them are fragments and secondhand accounts of what was being said in those pieces. However, it's interesting because one of the most important of his pieces was called Republic, which is to say, it was a critique of Plato's Republic. And in it, we find a Zeno that is certainly not this conservative, individualistic lover of domination that so many modern right wing Stoics are. In fact, it seems that Zeno's main criticism of Plato was that Plato wanted to order society by domination. And Zeno apparently thought that the ideal society was essentially one where everybody opted into that society, that they came to it as immigrants, per se, and that they essentially opted into living virtuous lives as Stoics. So he thought that it was much better to have a society based on consent than a society based on order by domination. And it's interesting.
Okay, so that's an extremely vague sentiment because guess who also would say that? Rousseau, every liberal thinker to ever exist. Probably to some degree, even Burke or liberal conservatives. But or fucking libertarians and ANCAPs. But the other thing is that that's not even what that is talking about. In other words, when you have ancient Greek thinkers like Plato or Aristotle or the Stoics or whoever talking about, okay, this is how politics should be, what they're saying is this is how you should conduct yourself in the political realm. They're not saying this is the ideal social order that we need to, exercise our human subjectivity to attain, right? They're not saying this is how we should transform society. They're saying this is how you should conduct yourself in the political realm. This is the kind of political ethics that you should have, right? Because for them, politics is not about the transformation of the social world. Politics is about ethics. It's about being in line with certain obligations, right? Because in the ancient world, you don't have this concept of using human agency to fundamentally transform the world, right? Because in the ancient world, the cycles of nature determine politics and the forces of the spiritual world determine politics, right? And so only then, after being mediated by those two things, do people have a hand in politics, right? Whereas in the modern world, basically the presupposition is that people have more of an influence over politics than does natural cycles or the spirit world.
Yeah, so with Locke, you consent. With Rousseau, you're made to consent.
Interesting because Zeno was openly admitting that what he was envisioning was a utopia, but he was using it as a way to understand that ideal society. He laid out a society that was mediated entirely by the virtue of individuals, a society filled with Stoics. And it might shock a lot of right-wing Stoics to hear it, but he believed in equality of the sexes, abolition of nationalism, abolition of slavery, and
okay, he can't have been for abolition of nationalism because nationalism didn't exist yet. So
Okay, bro. Yeah, abolition of nationalism.
and abolition of all rulership. He believed that worship of God should not be confined to the temples.
Actually, that's funny. Do you think Anark is a primordialist? Like in terms of nationalism?
oh god, I hope not.
For those who don't know, primordialism, basically it's the take that nationalism is like a pre-modern thing too. It's not just a modern thing. That's what like primordialism means in nationalism studies. So it could be that Anark, which is not a position you should have as an anarchist typically. But whatever.
But that the divine was all present and therefore accessible to all people. For good measure, he also believed in polyamory. When you consider this all together, you get a Stoicism that is a lot closer to anarchism than it might appear at first glance. For Zeno, the individual wasn't the end of the story. The individual was part of a rich social tapestry. Zeno recognized that a
God.
society based
This is more Bookchin and his consequences, where it's like anarchism is when you recognize that the individual is social. It's like everybody everywhere throughout all of time knows that the individual is social. right? Like, this is not a critique of anything. Like, what do you like?
Based on coercion was negative, that was not a good thing, that a society based on consent, a society where all things were held in common, was a much better society. And this stood at odds with the majority of the philosophers of his time. Another thing to note is that Zeno, despite being a merchant early in
Plato also believed in common ownership, buddy.
I can't wait for I can't wait for Platonic anarchism. That'll be fun. Yeah, that'll be interesting. Hi, Anark. We can talk about Platonic anarchism.
in life was absolutely not an elitist in his practice either. In fact, Zeno, by the end of his life, had been very successful and had created a sort of school of Stoic philosophy. And by the end of his life, he had two disciples who were named Cleanthes and Ariston. And Ariston was sort of a classical polymath. He knew everything about all of the philosophies of the Greek schools at the time. And he was kind of seen as the one who was favored to become the head of the school after Zeno died. By contrast, Cleanthes was working class. He watered the gardens of the rich. He was a wrestler. He was humble and hardworking.
Did not exist in ancient Greece. Please stop this. There was no working class in ancient Greece, right? At best, you were like you were probably a slave. You were either a slave or a slave owner, basically, or you were farming somebody else's land or something. Like, it's not, there was not a working class.
I love this like trans historicism we're doing. That's such a fun brain. Like we just completely don't know anything about history, but hey, we'll wing it anyways.
And interestingly, Zeno, close to his death, chose Cleanthes over Ariston. And this may sound like it would be a big risk, but Cleanthes was actually responsible for the long-term proliferation of the Stoic school of philosophy. He grounded Stoicism in practice, not just ideas. Also, remember how I mentioned the Stoa of Stoicism, where it got its name? It's really important to note that that was a public meeting place. At that time, a lot of the Greek schools were on gymnasia, which were essentially places where people went to work out. And gymnasia didn't let women go on to the site. So most Greek schools of philosophy could not be attended by women. It was basically only the Stoics and the Epicureans for which women could attend at the time of Zeno of Citium. It would become a little more normal in the Hellenist era that would follow, but he was actually living at the end of the classical era of Greece. So with all this in mind, the concept of Stoicism as being reserved for men and for rugged individualists is obviously completely wrong. That is a bastardization of Stoicism. Stoicism absolutely is not conservative. In fact,
yeah, it's not conservative because conservative is a modern thing.
It's not anarchist either.
Yeah, that's fine. Yes, it's not conservative. Unless we're using it's when you preserve society. Oh, okay. Which, of course, for trans-historicizing conservatism too here, that's awesome.
Its entire history, it has essentially been a cosmopolitan, ethical virtue system. It has been a system which attempts to help people during hard times get through those hard times. It helps them cultivate the skills that are needed to succeed even when everything around them is scary and difficult. It is not a rugged individualist system, and it does not teach people to suppress their emotions. These are all stereotypes of Stoicism, which I think are really harmful, given that Stoicism actually has a lot of really good things to teach people. As for myself, I don't know if I would call myself a Stoic, but I certainly do get a lot out of Stoicism.
You got a lot of that Wikipedia page you looked up? Is that what you got a lot of? The Wikipedia page?
This is also something that sort of annoys me a little bit. And Anarchism said this in his recent video about religion when he was talking about atheopaganism, some bullshit he read on the internet. It's like, well, I don't know if this thing they just made a whole video about. It's like, you're presenting this as something to supplement your anarchist politics with, but you're not even going to commit to that. Like, what is this non-committal, nonsense? Like, you're not going to commit to anarchism enough so that you need to supplement it with all this other shit. right? But you're not even commit to that in the end. Like, what is, like, why? Like, what? Excuse me?
I'm a vague little cheeky chipmunk, and I'm gonna say I'm gonna sit here for an hour and talk about how I love monarchy and how great monarchy is.
As for
Well,
myself, I don't know if I'm a monarchist.
I don't know if I'm a monarchist, but my cheeky chippy chipmunk cheeks, well, they blush whenever one of those big old kings or queens walks by. Oh, I don't know if I'm a stoic. I don't know if I'm a dreamer. Because maybe I'm not the only one. Yeah, okay.
I go back and I read the Enchiridion pretty regularly. I highly recommend that if you're looking for a text. And I think that it is very valuable to always be reminding yourself of what you control and what you do not control. Because what it's going to do is it's going to push you towards cultivating a better self, and a self that is able to actually confront the obstacles of the world. It's also going to help you not be so distressed by all of the things that you actually have no effect on, which are very distressing, things that are going to make you feel very nihilistic and hope.
That's a weird message for you to be giving. Hey, you can't really do anything about capitalism, so just fucking forget about it. You're gonna have to work that 9 to 5, so why do you bother care about it? Just do it. This is such a weird. Well, you could care about so many things, but why should you?
This is what happens when you do this eclecticism bullshit, where you try to supplement anarchism with a bunch of other fucking garbage.
You could just read anarchists. You don't have to. You don't have to go looking. You don't have to be like, my cosmology is so empty. I need the extra thing. Come on. I think this is the point when you define something as a negative, it leaves you empty, and all these people define anarchism as like, I'm against something.
When
Right?
there's no hierarchy.
When you do that, it does make you feel empty, because then you're not really thinking about the positives and the specifics.
Yeah.
And so then you're like, oh, well, anarchism is just like when I'm against hierarchy. So, it doesn't really leave me with much of anything. It's like when people defined atheism as like when you don't believe or
When I
whatever.
am not a theist, that's what atheism is. I am not a theist. That's what it means to be an atheist.
Right. The value of anarchism is not just like I'm against I'm against the meanie state, but it's like you as a specific positive society you want. That's supposed to be feeling.
It was also funny because when there were these like big debates on the internet over whether because basically for the entire duration from like the 90s to like 2014, anarchists, like most of what anarchists were doing on the internet was debating with ANCAPs. And the primary strategy of the ANCAPs for getting counted, or for arguing that they should be counted as anarchists, is that anarchism is just when you oppose the state. So, you could be for capitalism and oppose the state, technically. So anarcho-capitalism is completely acceptable.
Yeah, it's lame. It's lame because you could say, okay, fine. Individuals owning immediate private property, the whole world is just filled with like micro property. Fine, those are not states. The states require these like abstract imagined communities and a whole bunch of other things. Fine. I'll concede. There you go. You're against the state. But your world you advocate for is still drastically different from mine. So I could still argue on that. Like the whole, we're at pains to prove whether or not you're anti this or that is such a lame debate. It doesn't even get you anywhere. Like it's more interesting to debate the actual positive things. Like it's obvious. The problem we have with ANCAPs isn't merely that in consequence it's a state. Oh well, right? That's like the least of the problem. I mean, we're already against states. That's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is the world they demand effectively means every 5 steps you could get shot by some rando.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other thing.
Hopeless. It's very good to remind yourself that those are things you do not need to focus your mind on. You need to focus your mind on what you can control. And then once you have become capable, once you've become competent, once you have lots of power to affect other people, then you can actually focus your mind on those terrible things that you were worrying your mind about beforehand but had no control over. I also think it is very valuable for
All I'm hearing is, look, just get a grip on reality, then do politics. It's like that's not stoicism. Also, there's weird implications with that, by the way. I don't even agree with this
We
idea
need to
that
do stoicism so that we can say Jordan Petersonisms.
yeah, this just sounds like Jordan Peter. Like a lot of actually that makes sense. That actually makes a lot of sense actually, because a lot of it, like the way Anark talks, it's like a pseudo therapist, or he's like, "Mm, get the room, bucko, before you can become an anarchist."
people to be focusing on self-discipline and perseverance and cultivating willpower during difficult times. And we are absolutely in difficult times. So even if you don't want to consider yourself a Stoic, which is perfectly fine, I think there are a lot of very valuable lessons for you to take out of this philosophy. And I really wanted to present a fresh take on Stoicism as a philosophy to help other leftists and especially other anarchists to recognize that it is absolutely not a right-wing or fascist ideology. It is essentially
Okay, it's not fascist. It's not anarchist. We don't need it. Nobody needs it. Nobody should be using it. All you've convinced me is that nobody should be using this fucking label.
been co-opted by right-wingers. And you might be asking, what
No, it's been co-opted by politics, apparently. Like, it's not, the problem isn't just that it's been co-opted by whatever. Why are we trying to, like, oh, look, the right-wingers are playing with the concept, so we have to play with it now. What? Who cares? Let them play with concepts they don't understand. Why is it our problem? Why do we need to steal their toys? Who cares?
you, and I hope you took away some lessons that you can apply to your life. If you liked the video, you should go down and click like. If you have thoughts, you should go down there and
Looks like old Anark's got a case of the squeaky door eyebrow.
comment, tell me what you think. Also, if you want to support the channel, just want to ask you to go over to my
Don't do any of that. Don't like it. Don't comment. Be a stoic in regard to Anark videos and don't interact.
Look, you can't control Anark videos, so just
That's true. You can't control Anark videos. Okay. Being's last thoughts are pain, misery, but you know what? Let's be stoics today and let's just
yeah,
resign ourselves to cosmopolitan apathy about the world.
yeah.
All right, Piper, final thoughts.
Stop supplementing anarchism with random bullshit.